Hey there. You've found your way to Deep Sleep Story, where quiet tales are told slowly, with heart, and made for grown-up nights. Tonight's story is called After the Bridge. It's a gentle tale about three travelers, each carrying something different, a burden, a memory, a silence. And how, along the road, they learn to set it down. This story won't rush you. It's here to slow your breath, soften the world, and help the night arrive, one word at a time. So get comfortable. Let the weight of the day fall away. And if these stories bring you peace, I invite you to subscribe to Deep Sleep Story, where rest isn't a goal, it's a way home. Now, close your eyes. Let's begin. Walter Ashby hadn't planned to walk. He was meant to arrive by cart, a plain delivery, nothing grand, 12 hand-carved stones for the base of the new footbridge at Grafton Ford. It was supposed to be simple. Ride out from Winchester. 3 days at most. No drama, just wait and road. But on the morning he set off, the left wheel cracked on a ridge stone, and the whole axle gave way like a tired man falling to his knees. The cart skidded off the track into a marshy ditch. The farmer who owned the cart turned back. Walter kept going. Now he walked. The basket on his back pulled unevenly, filled with wrapped stone pieces, edgework, base supports, and one modest capstone with a shallow engraving on the underside, a half-sun hidden where it would never be seen. It trembled when he touched it, ever so slightly. He told himself it was the cold. Not fear. Not guilt. But stone doesn't lie. He passed 2 shepherds and a bent woman sweeping leaves with a bundle of twigs. No one greeted him, which suited him just fine. He preferred when people kept their thoughts tucked in. The path ran through hedge-lined lanes and hollowed oak trees, their insides blackened but living still. A rook followed him a while from tree to tree, flapping just when he forgot it was there. In the late afternoon, he stopped to retie a strap. The edge of the basket had started to cut into his shoulder. And that's when he saw her. She sat beneath a crooked tree, her back resting against the trunk, a great black iron pot beside her. She wasn't resting like someone weary, more like someone waiting. She didn't speak until he stepped into the dappled shade near her boots. "Do you carry tools?" she asked. Walter, not ready to speak yet, simply nodded. She stood, brushed her skirt free of dirt, and said, "Then we'll walk together." That was that. No further explanation. No introduction. They simply began to walk side by side. He learned her name a mile later, as they passed a crooked post with no sign. "Joan," she said without being asked. "Widow." Twice. "Don't bother with sorries." Walter gave a small grunt. "Walter." "Stones." "Stones?" He lifted the pack slightly. "For a bridge. In Grafton Ford." Her face didn't change. "I'm going there too." "Sort of." "Sort of? My mother's sister lived there once. Might still. Haven't had a letter in years." "Why now?" She looked ahead. "Because when no one answers long enough, it's your turn to speak." Walter nodded slowly. It wasn't agreement, but it was understanding. "And the pot?" he asked. "Memory," she replied too quickly. Then added, "It belonged to him. The second one." "Food?" "No," she said. "Just a pot." By dusk, they reached a fork in the road where a crumbling chapel slouched under ivy and moss. Its roof had long since surrendered to wind and rain, but the walls still stood, and in its center hung a rusted iron bell from a rotting beam. They agreed without words to stop there. Walter removed his basket carefully, setting it against the far wall. Joan knelt by the fire pit at the center, where stones were blackened and a few half-burnt sticks told of past travelers. She struck flint like she'd done it all her life, and soon the fire caught. While they worked in companionable silence, a third presence stirred the air. It came from the brush behind the chapel, slow feet, careful steps. Walter rose, hand instinctively reaching for a tool from the pack. Out stepped a boy. Thin. Barefoot. Cloaked in a patchy wool wrap, and carrying under his arm a book with no cover, its pages bent like dried petals. He looked no older than 16, maybe younger, with sharp gray eyes that studied them each in turn. "Cold comes fast here," he said. Joan tilted her head. "You're not from the farms?" The boy shook his head. "No." "Where are you going?" Walter asked. "To Grafton Ford." Walter paused. "Alone?" The boy lifted the book. "No. I carry words." He sat by the fire without asking. Joan handed him a heel of bread, which he took silently, nodding once. He didn't eat right away. Instead, he opened the book to a fresh page and began to write with a stub of charcoal he pulled from his sleeve. Joan leaned closer, squinting at the marks. "You write fast." "I only write what already exists," he said. "The rain didn't come in drops that morning. It came in threads. Long, fine, silvery cords that hung in the air like spun glass, quiet and constant. The kind of rain that soaks you slowly and leaves behind the scent of wet bark and clean soil." They walked with their heads tucked, shoulders hunched, 3 travelers wrapped in wool and silence. Their breath misted like fading prayers. The boy, who still had not given his name, walked ahead, barefoot, mud squeezing between his toes. Joan walked in the middle, cradling her heavy black pot with both hands, as though it were a swaddled child. Walter brought up the rear, adjusting the pull of his stone-laden basket every half-mile. They spoke little. Not because there was nothing to say, but because none of them knew how to begin. Just before noon, the road dipped into a hollow where the trees bowed close, and the fog turned the world to pewter. From somewhere beneath the scent of moss and cold wood smoke, they caught the first hints of onions, butter, and stewed something, real food. Joan slowed. "That's not wind," she murmured. Walter sniffed. "In?" The boy pointed. And through the haze emerged a crooked building, half-timbered and low, with a slate roof mottled green from age and damp. A large wooden gate stood open, carved in the shape of 2 open hands. And hanging from a frame above the door, a bell, larger than a man's head, smaller than a chapel's, strung with a thick hemp rope that ran inside through the wall. Carved above the doorway were the faded words, "The bell and the gate." Inside, the air was soft and warm. Not just heated, but lived in. The hearth crackled low, and the smell of broth curled around the beams like a scarf. A woman in an apron moved between tables, spooning stew from a cauldron with quick, practiced hands. She didn't speak, only nodded as they entered. Behind the counter sat a man on a raised wooden stool, very tall, or made so by the height of his perch. His beard was dark with silver, and his eyes were sharp and quiet. A leather strap tied around his right wrist connected him to the rope. It led up into the rafters, then back outside to the bell. He did not greet them. He did not need to. He simply tugged, once. Gong. The bell answered softly outside, like a yawn from a sleeping tower. Joan leaned toward Walter. "They say he lost his voice in a fire. Or gave it away," said the boy, who had never spoken so close. The man gestured to an empty table near the hearth. They sat. Moments later, the woman returned with 3 bowls, steaming, thick, fragrant. No bread, but she set down a small jar of salt and 3 wooden spoons. The boy ate slowly, reverently, 1 small scoop at a time. Joan dipped her spoon, tasted, and exhaled through her nose. Carrot. Leek. Parsnip. Walter chewed in silence. He hadn't realized how hollow he felt until warmth touched his ribs. Then Joan rose and approached the counter. She placed a single coin on the wood. "Is the road to Welcome Bridge passable?" The man read her lips. Paused. Then, 2 rings. Gong. Gong. Joan tilted her head. 2 means no. Or wrong. Walter stood. "Let me try." He approached the bar. Placed both hands on the wood. "My name is Walter Ashby. I'm a mason. I carry stones for Grafton Ford. I need to know if the low crossing is flooded." The man stared at him. Then pulled. 3 times. Gong. 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 Joan stiffened. The boy paused mid-bite. Walter's eyes narrowed. 3? Truth required, Jones said quietly. Walter flushed. I just told it. But the man did not ring again. He simply looked. Still. Expectant. Walter's throat tightened. I asked properly. No response. The woman behind the counter stepped forward now, took the coin from the wood, and replaced it with a small crust of bread. Her expression was blank. But her hands were gentle. Walter stared at her. Then turned to the man. Then to the bell rope. What truth do you want? He whispered. Jones stood now too. Maybe it's not the road he's asking about. Walter stepped back. Shame prickled behind his ears like sweat. He returned to the table. Ate a few more bites. Then pushed the bowl away. I don't like riddles. Maybe they're not riddles, said the boy. Maybe they're answers to questions you haven't asked yet. Walter looked at him sharply. The boy blinked. And then, for the first time, spoke a full sentence, clearly. My father was a bell ringer. Before the plague. He said sound doesn't tell you what you want. It tells you what you've hidden. He paused. I hear that man's bell in my ribs. Joan exhaled slowly. I believe you. They stayed until the bowls were scraped clean and the fire had dimmed. As they gathered their things, the boy tore a page from his notebook. He wrote something with his charcoal stub. Then he folded the page carefully, walked to the bar, and slid it across. The man took it. Read it. Looked up. He did not ring the bell. But for the first time. He smiled. Joan caught it. Walter didn't look. Outside the rain had stopped. But the world still dripped. And behind them, just as the door shut, the bell rang once. No reason. No answer. Just a note to carry forward. Walter chuckled. You a scribe? No, said the boy. I'm listening. To what? The boy turned a page, already black with script. To things that haven't been said yet. They fell into quiet again. The fire popped. Wind stirred the ivy above. Later, when the fire had dulled to soft orange and their bodies leaned toward sleep, the bell above shifted. Just once. No wind. No reason. Walter glanced up. Joan watched him watching it. Don't say it, she whispered. I wasn't going to. They lay near the embers, the boy curled around his book. Walter closed his eyes. And under his blanket, his hand found the carved capstone. It didn't shake. Not this time. But he did. The path turned softer after the inn, though the land did not. The earth was damp, mossy in places, and slick with past rain. The woods had grown denser here, but not dark, rather quiet, like a room where someone had just left. The only sounds were boots on mud, the shifting weight of Walter's stones, the creak of Joan's pot handle, and the near-silent scratch of Elric's charcoal across paper. They had not spoken since morning. Not from tension, but from something closer to reverence. As though words might wake something fragile. Walter found himself watching the way Joan walked. Steady, compact steps, arms balanced carefully, as if the pot were a message, not a burden. And Elric, always slightly ahead, always glancing, recording everything but himself. They passed a shepherd's marker, a wooden frame with weathered cloth tied to each limb. Red, yellow, blue. Small bells hung beneath the fabric, and when the wind touched them, they sang low, like bones cooling in water. Then the sign. Vivian, weaver of fields and thoughts. Elric stopped walking. She's real? He asked softly. Joan nodded. If this post is standing, then she's still weaving. They turned down the trail, passing between hedgerows grown thick with age. Here, the air smelled faintly of lavender, wool, and smoke, not fire smoke, but hearth smoke, slow and safe. And then they saw it. Vivian's house was low and long, built into a slight slope. It had no chimney, but smoke escaped from vents along the back wall. A wide porch ran the length of the front, and just beneath its awning sat the loom, massive, old, shining in parts where hands had worn down the wood. Cloth stretched from its arms, black ash-gray, silver thread twisting like veins through bark. Wind teased the edges of hanging sheets nearby, which fluttered like unfinished thoughts. And at the loom, her, straight-backed, barefoot, eyes covered with a thin wrap of cloth, dyed soft blue. Her hair was white and thick, braided once and tucked behind her ear. Her hands moved across the threads not by instinct, but by memory. By rhythm. She did not look up. But she spoke. "You walk like people carrying things that aren't theirs." The three of them froze. Joan stepped forward, bowing slightly. "We didn't mean to disturb." "You didn't," said Vivian, still weaving. "The road brings only those who are already being pulled." Walter cleared his throat. "We're passing through. To Grafton Ford." "The bridge," Vivian murmured. "Yes. I dreamed of it last week. It cracked in sunlight, then vanished." No one replied. Vivian touched the cloth she was working on and set the shuttle aside. "You may stay. The shed has dry straw. There will be food when the thread rests." And just like that, the audience ended. She returned to weaving. They settled in the small shed beside the house. It was clean, lined with burlap sacks, and smelled of salt and thyme. Joan stretched out near the door. Walter checked his stones. Elric wandered the edges, running his fingers along the grain of the walls. "She doesn't see," he whispered. "She does," said Joan. "Just not like us." That evening, Vivian called for them. Not loudly. Just enough. They joined her by the porch, where a narrow table had been laid with slices of flatbread, a bowl of thick bean paste, and roasted roots with vinegar and mustard seed. No meat. No spoons. They ate with their hands. It tasted better that way. "You don't ask names?" Walter said finally. Vivian tilted her head. "I don't need names to know people. But how do you speak to them?" "I don't," she said simply. "I listen." They ate the rest in silence. Afterward, Vivian rose and moved to the loom. She pulled from beside it a folded sheet of cloth, dark gray, striped with soft gold and blue thread. She held it up. "Tell me what you see." Elric stepped forward. "A river. Narrow at the top. Wider at the bottom." Joan frowned. "No, a spine. Or branches." Walter squinted. "A road. But one that splits." Vivian smiled faintly. "Each answer is correct. Because you see what you bring." She offered the cloth to them. "It belongs to the three of you. But to take it, you must leave something behind." They hesitated. Vivian added, "Not something of weight. Something of memory." Elric was first. He opened his notebook and tore out a page from the very beginning. It was blank, but smudged with fingerprints and the shadow of a half-written line. "This was going to be the first story I wrote about someone else," he said. Joan looked down at her pot. Then, slowly, she reached inside and removed the cracked lid, worn at the edge where it had once been gripped by another hand. She set it on the porch floor quietly. Walter stood frozen. Vivian waited. Finally, he stepped back into the shed and returned with a small stone, flat, gray, with one smooth edge. Not one of the carved pieces. Just one he kept. "I touched this every time I didn't speak." He laid it down without further comment. Vivian nodded. She folded the cloth. "Then it's yours." And handed it to Elric. That night, as stars bled slowly into the sky, they lay side by side in the shed, warm beneath blankets she'd left for them. Joan whispered, "Why did you write your first story and never finish it?" Elric replied without hesitation, "Because I thought no one would stay long enough to hear it." Walter didn't say anything. But he didn't turn away either. And outside, beneath the awning, the loom ticked gently on. The rain caught up with them again by mid-morning. But this time, it didn't press, it followed, like a dog unsure of whether it was wanted. The path turned low and wide, tracing the banks of a river swollen from weeks of spring melt. Mist drifted lazily along the ground. Elric walked with the cloth from Vivian's loom folded carefully in his bag, as if it might whisper if bent too far. Joan, now used to the rhythm of her pot against her hip, hummed softly under her breath. Not a tune, just a vibration to keep time. Walter walked slower than usual. Not from pain. From weight. But not the kind he could measure. They saw him before they heard him, a hunched figure by the riverside, his wagon half covered by an old sailcloth, its wheels sunk slightly into the damp earth. Smoke rose from a narrow chimney fitted crookedly into a box-shaped stove. Beside the wagon stood a grinding wheel, built into a wide plank with pedals, and beside that, a stool covered in waxed cloth. The man leaned over the wheel, turning it slowly by hand. His cap was patched, his coat too short in the arms. But his eyes were bright, and he was singing to the river, a quiet hum that ended each line with a low chuckle. When he saw them approach, he waved without standing. "Well now," he called. "Either you're lost, or the road has finally decided to bring me some new shoes." Joan smiled. "We're neither, but we'll gladly listen if you're talking." "I'm always talking," he said. "The trick is knowing what to hear." His name was Martin, though he called himself Martin of the River Mist. He said it like a story that had never needed correcting. Walter noted the tools hanging from hooks inside the wagon: shears, whetstones, clamps, files. There were no weapons, no chains. Just the tools of someone who cared for edges. "I sharpen things," Martin said. "Knives, spades, chisels, sickles. Once, even a quill." Elric tilted his head. "A quill?" Lady said it wouldn't write truths unless the tip was honest. He cackled at his own joke. No one else did. But the silence was kind. Martin invited them to sit. Laid out old crates and a padded log. He offered roasted apples wrapped in cloth, not fresh but warm. They ate slowly. Joan finally asked, "How long have you been here?" Martin shrugged. "Time's slippery near rivers. Long enough to forget why I came. Not long enough to stop waiting." Walter looked at the grinding wheel. "Still working?" "Always. Sometimes it sharpens steel. Sometimes it just reminds me that things can still turn." He paused, then looked directly at Walter. "You carry stone, yes?" Walter stiffened. Martin pointed at the small crack in the rim of the wheel. "I once sharpened a mason's hammer. He didn't say thank you. But he left behind a piece of marble. Flat, white, silent. I keep it for when words fail." Walter said nothing. Joan caught his glance, soft, brief, but full. Elric wandered toward the wagon, studying the edges of Martin's notes scrawled onto hanging bits of cloth. Each one had a single sentence. "Don't wait for the bread to remember the oven. Even dull blades leave shadows. The one who sharpens forgets least." Elric touched the last one. "You wrote these?" Martin leaned back. "Didn't need to. I listened to them being said by things that can't speak." Joan chuckled lightly. Walter didn't. Then, slowly, Martin stood and pulled a tool from Walter's pack, a flat chisel with a blunted edge. Walter hadn't noticed him do it. "This one's earned its nap," Martin said. "But it still remembers how to bite." He pressed the chisel against the stone, and the grinding began, soft at first, like rain on canvas. Then steady. Walter watched. Every sound felt like a memory. When Martin finished, he handed it back. "No charge," he said. "Only promise me one thing." "What?" Martin stepped close. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "When you place the stone, do it without shaking." Walter's throat tightened. He nodded. That was all. They stayed one more hour. Martin told them about a blacksmith's daughter who forged bells without tongues. About a man who wanted his shovel to forget the graves it had dug. And a knife that refused to be sharp again until someone apologized. Each story ended with a wink. Or a sigh. Or silence. And when they rose to leave, Martin handed Elric a small tin box. "For the cloth," he said. "It shouldn't sleep in air." Elric opened his mouth to thank him. But no words came. So he just bowed. Martin grinned. "That's better than talking." As they walked away, Joan turned back once. Martin had returned to his stool. The wheel was turning again. But this time, he wasn't sharpening anything. He was just listening to the stone. And smiling. The day turned long and narrow, like the path itself. The sun, which had threatened to break through all morning, simply gave up by noon. Mist clung to the hills, not in thickness, but in memory, as if the air still remembered being fog. Joan walked slightly ahead now, her pot steadied by a makeshift cloth sling she tied around her shoulder. Walter's pace was slower than usual, but more deliberate. Elric kept near the trees, dragging the tip of a stick through the mud, not riding, just listening to the line it left. They were each inside themselves. But they were also together. That's why, when they came upon the fork, they didn't need to speak. 3 paths. Left, flat and open, but waterlogged. Right, overgrown. Middle, narrow, gravel-bound, with the faint scent of ash and flour? Elric inhaled. Someone once made bread here. Joan nodded. And something else. Something heavy. Walter stepped into the center path. This way smells like old rooms. And again, no one argued. They found the mill near dusk, tucked behind a low rise, partially hidden by a stand of crooked poplars. It leaned forward, as if bowing in apology. The wheel, half submerged in the marshy brook, was still. The wood of its frame had silvered, and one blade was cracked clear through. But it stood. It waited. The door was open, not wide, but just enough to ask a question. Joan placed her hand on the edge of it and whispered, "We'll knock in silence." Inside, dry air, thick with flour dust, and the ghost of heat long gone. Sunlight filtered through high slats, slicing the space into warm and cool. And on the far wall, they saw it. A list. Painted directly onto the wall in dark, looping strokes. Not charcoal. Not ink. Something stronger, burn on, perhaps, with oil and iron. Dozens of names. Each followed by dates, weights, and simple goods. Hal Kettering, 2 sacks rye, 1 grind fee. Tess of Kello, 3 bushels barley, a pair of mended boots. E. Ashby, 2 bushels, 1 roof beam. Ode and Faith. Elric said it first. Nothing is crossed out. Walter had already stepped closer. His mouth was tight. His shoulders tight. Joan watched him for a moment, then turned to the wall. Why write them so large? So no one could pretend not to see, Elric said quietly. Joan ran her fingers along the painted edge. This isn't debt, she said. It's memory. They set up camp inside the old mill. The air was dry enough, and the cracked grindstone near the corner made a passable bench. Walter took the far wall, dropping his basket of stones with the kind of breath that meant more than weight. Joan unpacked the bread, a wrapped bit of soft cheese, and the last 2 apples from Martin. Elric took up his usual post by the light, notebook open, charcoal at the ready. But he didn't write. He was watching the wall. The names feel awake, he said. That night, after they'd eaten, the silence grew heavy. Not empty, just full of things not yet said. Walter finally broke it. My father's name is on that wall. Joan looked up. E. Ashby, he said. He died when I was a boy. I didn't know he ever came here. Joan didn't press. But Elric did. Do you think he paid it back? Walter didn't answer for a long time. I think, he said slowly, he meant to. No one asked more. They laid out their sleeping cloths beneath the loft beam. Joan's pot rested near the doorway, lid tied down with a strip of thread from Vivian. Elric curled with his back to the list, but his eyes flicked toward it every few minutes. Just before sleep pulled them under, a sound creaked across the floorboards. Not footsteps. Not wind. Something between presence and memory. Joan sat up. Walter reached for a tool, a flat stone blade he hadn't sharpened in years. Elric whispered, It's not someone. It's something. They waited. But nothing came. In the morning, light slanted down across the list, and something had changed. One of the names, Edric Ashby, had a single line drawn through it. Neat. Final. Not erased. Not removed. Just acknowledged. Walter stared at it for a long time. Joan placed a hand gently on his shoulder. He nodded, then walked outside alone. He sat near the wheel for a while, watching a waterbird pace along the far bank. In his hand, the small stone he had once meant to leave at Vivian's. Not the carved ones. Not the work. The memory. He rubbed his thumb across its edge. Then reached out and placed it gently in the crack of the old mill's wall. Just enough for it to rest. Just enough for it to stay. When he turned back, Joan and Elric were waiting by the path. They didn't speak. But they didn't need to. And as they left the mill, Elric added a new line to his notebook. Some debts repay themselves in silence. Some names only want to be remembered. They reached Hollowgate by late morning. The road curved along a shallow ridge, where the wind tugged at cloaks and dried sweat off brows. Wildflowers lined the ditches, mostly pale violets and long-stemmed whitegrass, and bees moved among them like they had somewhere else to be. As the town rose ahead, the smell of open bread, animal fur, and oiled wool filled the air. Hollowgate wasn't much more than a cluster of stone and timber homes gathered like cousins around a square. But on market day, it swelled, voices, baskets, clatter, and all the clumsy noise of life when it forgets to whisper. Joan smiled the moment they stepped under the wooden gate. I've missed the sound of bartering. Elric tucked his book under one arm. I've never bartered anything. Walter scanned the crowd. Keep your hands close. Towns like this take more than they give. But despite the bustle, the mood was light, the kind of soft, crack-laugh liveliness that comes only when there's nothing too heavy in the sky. The market spread in 4 arms from the square: grains, tools, clothes, and animals. Walter disappeared toward the tools, drawn by muscle memory and the sound of whetstones. Joan busied herself with herbs, dried beans, and clay pots better balanced than hers. Elric wandered. Quiet. Always watching. It was he who saw the boy first. Not because the boy made a sound, he didn't. But because everything else did. And the boy didn't belong to the noise. He sat cross-legged on the worn flagstones at the edge of the square, beside a sagging awning that sold pickled roots. A tattered blanket lay beneath him, though he sat mostly on the stone. His shirt was large, stained, and faded in the sun. Bare feet. Charcoal-streaked hands. And beside him, drawings. Not on paper. Not for sale. Scribbled in ash and chalk directly onto the stone tiles around him. Circles, eyes, open mouths, and outlines of people. Not portraits. Not copies. Visions. Elric watched for a moment, then turned toward Joan and waved her over. She came with 2 apples in one hand and a strand of garlic hanging from the crook of her arm. What is it? He only pointed. They stood together in silence as the boy continued to draw. His eyes never rose. His fingers moved quickly, not in bursts, but as if guided by sound rather than sight, and not the sound of his surroundings, but something underneath the world. Joan crouched beside him. Do you want food? No answer. I'll trade an apple for a name, she said kindly. Still silence. The boy shifted his grip, began a new face. The lines were soft, childlike, but confident. 2 wide eyes. A narrow chin. A cloak over one shoulder. He pointed, to Joan. Then back to the drawing. Joan blinked. The face wasn't exact, but it felt like her. Her strength. Her guarded tenderness. The pot was there, too, not as object, but as anchor. Walter joined them, frowning. What's all this? Elric gestured. He draws who he sees. But he doesn't look. Walter muttered. No, Elric agreed. He doesn't need to. The boy's hand had already started a new figure. Walter. Not tall but firm. Shoulders rounded forward. The face obscured, but the hands were open, palms lifted like offering something invisible. And beneath the feet, a soft curve of stone, cradled, not burdened. Walter stepped back, lips tight. I don't like this. Joan looked at him. Because it's true? He didn't reply. The boy's next face was Elric. But this time, he didn't draw immediately. He paused, tilted his head. Then, without any expression, drew a line, not across the face, but across the chest. Diagonal. Soft, but clear. A fracture. Elric knelt closer. "Why that line?" No answer. But the boy reached out, placed a charcoal-smudged finger on Elric's ribs. Then pointed to his own chest. Then shook his head. Joan whispered. "He says you think from here." She tapped her temple. "But you carry from here." She tapped his heart. Elric looked down at the drawing. Then smiled, a small, sad smile, as if something inside him had just exhaled after holding its breath for years. Around them, townsfolk passed. Most ignored the boy. Some whispered, "That mute's still scribbling faces," someone said. "He doesn't beg, just draws," said another. "Freak child." Joan stood, her eyes narrowed. But the boy didn't flinch. Didn't hear. Or maybe, chose not to. Walter stepped forward, pulled a small, rounded stone from his pocket, and placed it beside the boy's blanket. "You saw more than I wanted you to." He paused. "Thank you." Elric tore a page from his book, not blank, not a poem, just lines, tangled like vines around a single word. Stillness. He folded it into a triangle, and placed it gently beside the drawings. Joan placed her apple beside the bowl. The boy didn't look up. But he did, for the first time, smile. They left the market late. As they walked along the outer road, the hills rolling gold under the setting sun, Joan asked, "Do you think he was alone?" Walter shrugged. "Alone is complicated." Elric walked quietly for a long time. Then finally said, "He wasn't drawing what we look like now." Joan turned. "What then?" Elric's voice was soft. "He was drawing what's left behind when we go." They walked the rest of the hour in thoughtful silence. That night, they stopped beside a low grove of birches. The ground was soft with fallen leaves. Joan built a fire. Walter stacked stones for a windbreak. Elric sat by the flame, turning his folded paper over and over in his hands. Before sleep, Joan whispered, "Do you ever wonder what your face would look like if someone drew you with your eyes closed?" Walter didn't answer. Elric did. "I think he didn't draw us to remember." Joan looked at him. "No, I think," he said, "he drew us so we'd stop forgetting." By midday, the path narrowed into something less certain. The road curved along the slope of a wide valley, soft, open land with wheat dancing in the breeze, poppies tipping in and out of the grass like nodding heads. But the openness brought with it a strange quiet, one that seemed to press against the ribs. Joan walked ahead, chewing a sprig of wild mint. Walter followed at his usual, measured pace. Elric lagged a few steps behind, notebook tucked under one arm, eyes on the sky more than the ground. They'd been walking for an hour without speaking. Not from silence, from holding. Each of them knew something was coming. None of them wanted to name it. They saw the figures around a bend. 3 men, standing directly across the track, not guarding, but occupying. Like boulders left after a storm. 2 stood. 1 sat on a low stone. None of them moved when the travelers came into view. The first man, younger, narrow-faced, leaned on a polished walking stick. The second held a rolled parchment. The third, seated, had short hair, a long coat, and a tarnished brass brooch on his chest in the shape of a cracked coin. Walter slowed. Joan touched her pot strap. Elric squinted. The man on the stone raised a hand. "No passing," he said calmly. "The road is measured." Walter stepped forward. "Measured how?" "By what you carry," the man replied. Joan raised an eyebrow. "We carry no trade." "Everything is trade," said the parchment holder. "Even memory." Elric felt the tension roll off Walter like heat. He leaned closer. "You know them?" Walter didn't answer. But he didn't deny it either. The seated man stood. He wasn't tall, but upright, the kind of posture that made others listen without wanting to. His voice was firm. Unhurried. I thought I recognized the step, he said. Even without the tools. Joan blinked. Walter's expression hardened. Nathan. The man, Nathan, smiled faintly. Walter Ashby. Alive and still walking. A surprise. Joan looked between them. You know each other? Walter's jaw moved, then stilled. We trained together. Years ago. Stonework. Ely Cathedral. Elric's eyes widened. That's where. Walter cut in. Yes. Nathan folded his arms. You're a long way from vaults and arches, Ashby. Walter stepped closer. Let us pass. Have I said no? You haven't said yes. Nathan tilted his head. This stretch belongs to the quiet toll, he said. We asked not for gold, but acknowledgement. Joan narrowed her gaze. Of what? Nathan didn't answer. He simply looked at Walter. A pause hung between them like a held breath. Walter slowly unslung his pack. Unfastened it. Removed a stone, finely carved beveled edges, with his mark etched lightly on the side. It was meant for the bridge in Grafton Ford. He held it out, not like a weapon, like a weight. I made this, he said. My hands. My line. Nathan stepped closer. You always had a clean cut. Walter nodded once. Then you'll remember what happened when the line was off. Nathan's mouth twitched. It wasn't your design. No, Walter said. But I signed it. Elric tensed. Joan's voice came like a bell behind them. 3 men died. Silence. Nathan looked down at the stone. You still carry that guilt? Walter didn't answer. But he set the stone gently at Nathan's feet. And stepped back. Nathan stared at it. Then stepped around it. Go, he said. You've already paid. The 2 men beside him said nothing. Elric tucked his book under his arm. Joan gave Walter a long, searching look. They walked on. They didn't speak again until the ridge crested and the road dropped toward a field of larches. Walter finally exhaled. He told me to change the measure. 1 inch. Said it would even the arch. Joan touched his sleeve. And you did? I trusted him. Elric was silent. Joan's voice was quiet. That doesn't make it your fault. Walter looked at his hands. No. But I'm the one who didn't question. That night, they camped by a bend in the stream where the water sang over stones like wind through reeds. Joan brewed mint and thistle into a bitter tea. Walter built the fire. Elric, for the first time, did not write. He simply folded a piece of paper and drew a single line across it, from corner to corner, then handed it to Walter. Walter stared at it. Not angry. Not confused. Then folded it in half again. And slipped it into his pack. Joan watched him. Are you going to leave that stone behind? Walter looked at the stars. No. I'm going to set it where it was meant to go. And when the fire dimmed, he slept without waking. The land flattened gently as they walked, softening into long green stretches broken only by low stone walls and the wind's hush over tall grass. They had been descending all morning, not sharply, but steadily, as if the earth itself was ushering them downward towards something that waited without name. The sky had turned the color of fresh parchment, streaked with feathery clouds. No threat. Just light and movement. They didn't speak much that morning. Elric walked in the middle now, not behind. Joan had slowed her steps, often glancing side to side. Not looking for danger, but landmarks. Walter, for the first time, hummed. A low, almost inaudible sound, not melody, but rhythm. Like the sound of a hammer before the strike. They smelled the river before they saw it. Cool stone. Wet bark. Old iron. Then came the sound, not a rush, not a roar, just the folding hush of water curling around itself. Like breath through soft linen. It was a narrow channel, but deep at the center, with alder trees leaning close as if whispering to their own reflections. The bank sloped wide on either side, dotted with flat rocks and tufts of sweetgrass. Walter stopped first. He looked at the water the way a man looks at someone he once left behind. Not with fear, but with a slow ache of recognition. Joan caught up to him. "This isn't Grafton Ford?" Walter shook his head. "That's still a day ahead. This is something else." He didn't explain. And she didn't press. They chose a place near a smooth bend in the river, where the current curved around a large, flat stone that jutted into the shallows. The breeze cooled, scented with leaf and distant wood smoke. Joan removed her pot and sat cross-legged on a patch of dry moss. She didn't stretch. Just rested. Elric wandered the edge, his fingers trailing through the tall grass. He paused once to kneel and press his palm to the earth, eyes closed. Walter opened his pack. Inside, beneath the wrapped tools and shaped stone blocks, nestled in its own cloth wrap, was the stone. Not one for building. Not etched. Just smooth. Pale. Oval. Granite, rounded by time and carried for years. His thumb ran across it now, not absent-mindedly, but with purpose. He touched this stone so many times before. In fear. In guilt. In silence. Today, it was something else. He stood, unwrapping it gently, and walked toward the water's edge. The river seemed to quiet itself as he approached. The current slowed, or perhaps just sounded slower. A bird called once in the distance, then stopped. Walter stepped into the water. Cold, but not biting. A chill that reminded the body it was awake. He walked 2 paces in, boots submerged. The water reached his knees. Beneath his soles, smooth stones shifted gently. He knelt. Held the stone in both hands, looked at it for a long time. "I didn't know," he said softly. No one responded. The river didn't need to. He lowered the stone into the current. Not dropped. Not cast. Just placed. It sank slowly, nestled into the silt between 2 larger rocks. No splash. No ceremony. But something inside his chest let go. Like a string drawn tight for too long, finally easing, without breaking. He stayed there a moment longer. Then rose, water clinging to his clothes like memory. On shore, Joan had been watching. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She only nodded once, as if someone had answered a question she hadn't said aloud. Walter stepped out, water streaming from his boots. Joan offered him a cloth, not to dry off, just to hold. He took it. Sat beside her. Said nothing. Elric joined them soon after, settling with his legs crossed and the woven cloth from Vivian in his lap. He smoothed it gently, running his fingers along the threads. After a pause, Joan spoke. "I've been thinking." Walter looked up. "I want to stay," she said. "In Grafton Ford. If it's still the kind of place I remember." Walter studied her. "Because of your aunt?" She shook her head. "Because I want to build something I won't have to carry." Elric asked. "What if the town has changed? Then I'll plant something small. In my own soil." Walter didn't speak. But he reached into his pack and pulled out the folded paper Elric had once given him, the one with the diagonal line. He placed it beside Joan. She didn't open it. She just placed her hand over it. Elric, quietly, opened his notebook. For once, he didn't write a poem. Or a story. Just a letter. To no one. Or maybe, to who he had been. He read a line aloud. "We are not what we carry. We are what we choose to leave." Then tore the page out, folded it in 4, and tucked it into the edge of a willow tree's bark. Let the wind keep it. They stayed until the light turned amber. The bridge, the one they had walked toward for days, was just visible now in the distance. Not grand. Not wide. But there. Joan lifted her pot. Elric folded the cloth. Walter rose with his pack, lighter now, in more ways than one. No one looked back at the water. But each of them felt something had been left behind. Not lost. Just released. By morning, the hills had stopped rising. The path leveled into long, low land, where the wind moved easily and the grass shifted like breathing skin. Trees thinned to lonely pairs, their shadows long and soft across the road. Somewhere ahead, though not yet in sight, waded the river that gave the town its name. They knew it was near. They didn't say it. Walter walked a few steps ahead today. Elric behind him, not riding. Joan at the center, holding her pot not by its strap now, but gently, like something she was preparing to set down. They crested a final shallow ridge and saw it. The bridge. It was not grand. Not ornate. Just long, solid, and purposeful, spanning the Grafton waters in a clean curve of timber and stone. Its wood looked freshly treated. Sunlight danced on the rails, and moss had begun to creep onto its uprights. Beneath it, the wide, slow river, the color of sky diluted by memory. Beyond it, the rooftops of Grafton Ford, peeking between rows of elms and half-buried gardens. Walter exhaled through his nose. That's it. Joan stopped beside him. Elric a step behind. No one spoke. Not yet. Walter set down his pack at the foot of the bridge. From inside, he drew the final piece, the one he had saved for this moment. Not the rough memory stone he left in the river. This one was carved, shaped, and clean. A small capstone, with a shallow sun etch just below the edge, not visible from above. Just present. Like breath under skin. He stepped to the southern foundation, where the wooden brace met the old stone base. There was a place prepared for it, just wide enough, just deep enough. He knelt. His fingers brushed the slot. Then the edges. Then the stone itself. And then, slowly, he pressed it in. A perfect fit. He placed his palm over it, and closed his eyes. For a moment there was no sound. No birds. No breeze. Just the weight of completion. Not triumph. Not joy. Peace. Joan reached him as he stood. You built it. Walter nodded. I helped it stand. Elric crouched beside the stone, brushing a finger along the etching. Why a sun? Walter looked out at the water. To remind it what rises. They crossed the bridge together. Each step was deliberate, but easy, not the heaviness of arrival, but the movement of something finishing itself naturally. They paused halfway, looking down at the current, where fish darted below and reeds whispered in the shallows. Joan let her fingers graze the rail. This place feels like it's always been here, Elric offered. She nodded. Walter smiled faintly. Because it has. Grafton Ford welcomed them not with fanfare, but familiarity. Children ran between houses, chasing linen flags. A woman with flour on her sleeves swept her steps. A goat stood stubbornly in someone's doorway. Somewhere, a song was being hummed off-key. The village was small, aging gracefully, no more than 20 homes, a chapel with a cracked bell, a market square barely large enough for 10 stalls. Joan stopped in front of one of the cottages near the square. It had a crooked stone porch, 2 low windows, and a hanging pot on the post, not for flowers, but for remembering. She stepped closer. Looked to the door. Knocked once. It opened. An older woman stood there, gray-haired, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the warm weather. Her eyes narrowed at first. Then softened. Joni? She whispered. Joan's voice cracked. Anthea. They didn't hug. Not immediately. First they looked. Really looked. Then arms found arms, and Joan's pot dropped to the step. Walter and Elric stood back. After a time, Joan turned to them, smiling through tears. I'll stay, she said. If she'll have me. Thea chuckled. Of course I will. I've been waiting since the last letter never came. Joan looked at Walter. You. Walter gestured to Elric. We're still walking. They stayed in the village one night. Joan led them to a small guest room in the back of Thea's home. There, they shared bread with wild garlic, tea brewed in an old copper kettle, and stories they only half finished before falling asleep. In the morning, Elric left the folded page, the one he'd written by the river, on Joan's windowsill. Walter placed a chisel by her door, wrapped in twine. Joan gave each of them a piece of dried pear. Never travel without something sweet, she said. They hugged. This time, they held on longer. The road past Grafton was less defined, not less real, just less walked. Walter and Elric followed it, side by side, not in haste. After a while, Elric said, "You could have stayed." Walter nodded. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" Walter thought a moment. "Because I'm not finished shaping what I carry." Elric smiled. "Then let's keep walking." They did. That night, they stopped near an abandoned watchtower, where the stones had sunken into moss and the stars stretched wide. Walter sat by the fire, chisel in hand, shaping a piece of oak just for the feeling of motion. Elric watched. Then opened his book, and began to write the first line not for a record, but for a story. Once there were three who walked not to find something, but to leave something behind. And in doing so, they found everything they needed. Time didn't end at the bridge. It simply began to fold inward, like cloth drawn carefully into a drawer. The road continued, of course, farther, wider, but for those who'd crossed that simple stretch of timber in Grafton Ford, something changed. They stopped walking with the weight of what had been, and began walking with the shape of what might be. Joan stayed. Not because she was tired, not because she'd arrived, but because when she stepped into her aunt's garden and touched the warm wood of that crooked gate, something inside her, a thread pulled tight for too long, loosened. Thea's house had only 2 rooms, but the windows faced the morning. The garden, half swallowed by weeds, responded to Joan's hands as if remembering her. She didn't fix everything at once. She planted onions first, then beans, then thyme, then poppies, red and orange, for brightness, not use. She began waking before the sun, boiling water in the dented kettle, then standing barefoot in the garden, letting the dew soak through her soles. Sometimes she spoke aloud, not to anyone, just to the earth. People in town began to greet her by name, then bring her jars, then ask her advice. She never wore a shawl the same way twice. The pot she carried all those miles now lived in the window, filled not with food, but smooth stones, each one found near water. She never told anyone what they meant. But once a month, she crossed the bridge alone and placed one on its edge. Walter and Elric walked east first. The road there grew harder, stone-bound, wind-bitten, steep. Villages scattered farther apart. People watched longer before speaking. But they kept moving. Walter had begun carving again. Not arches. Not monuments. Objects that stayed in hands. Bowls. Walking sticks. Door handles for chapels that didn't ask questions. He never signed them. But each one had a soft hollow beneath, just deep enough to rest a thumb. A gesture. Not a mark. Elric, in turn, began writing not what happened, but what was becoming. Stories about people who didn't know they were heroes. About quiet traders, old bells, and girls who carried pots full of stone. In a coastal town called Estmere, a bookseller read one aloud in the square. When a woman cried at the ending, Elric didn't apologize. He just offered her another page. They weren't always together. Sometimes Walter would stay behind, helping repair a lintel beam or rebalance a bridge step, while Elric wandered ahead, mapping with words. They never agreed when to meet, they simply did. Walter would arrive as Elric closed his notebook. Or Elric would appear as Walter swept the final chiseled dust from a bench. They didn't explain this rhythm. They trusted it. Years passed. And one summer, after a long, quiet journey west, they returned to Grafton. The town hadn't changed much. The poppies Joan planted now grew wild beyond her gate. The chapel's bell had been retied with leather cord. The market still sold cheese that crumbled if held too tightly. They waited outside Joan's gate for nearly an hour. No reason. Just to listen. When she finally opened the door, she didn't blink. She said, "I thought it might be today." Walter smiled. Elric bowed. They stayed 3 nights. Thea had passed the year before. Joan spoke of her only once. She said, "She left the window open that morning. As if she knew I'd need the breeze more than the answer. Elric gave her a small cloth-bound book. Not finished, but full of quiet beginnings. Walter carved her a low bench for the garden. It had no ornament, but when she sat on it, it didn't move. On the last evening, as the fire dimmed, Joan asked, "Will you stop someday?" Walter looked into the coals. "I think I already did," Elric added. "Stopping isn't the same as staying." She nodded, then stood, and gave them each a small stone from the pot. "No two the same," she said. "Like truths." Walter turned his in his hand. Elric pocketed his without looking. No words followed. They didn't need them. The next morning, they crossed the bridge again. This time, without looking back. But Joan stood at her gate, and watched them until they were gone from view. Then she turned, stepped into the garden, and planted lavender. Because she wanted the bees to stay longer. Somewhere, much later, a child sat beneath a tree, leafing through a book full of stories that didn't name their heroes. A mason in a town called Miller's Rise picked up a walking stick and smiled at the curve of it. A boy with wide eyes pointed to a flat river stone someone had left on a bridge's rail and asked, "Who put that there?" And the wind, passing through tall grass, carried the answer only in its movement. "That's it." They crossed the bridge. And maybe, so did you. Some stories don't need a grand ending. Just a quiet moment. And the right time to let go. Thank you for listening to Deep Sleep Story. If this tale brought you calm, or helped your night feel lighter, you're always welcome here. Feel free to subscribe if you haven't yet. And share this story with someone else who might need a quiet road to follow tonight. Until next time, sleep well, and dream gently.